He once boasted he could have killed 500 people had he not been stopped. The man who once called himself the murderer of the century.
The police in London are engaged in what could be Britain's biggest mass murder investigation involving up to 16 deaths.
London. Winter, 1978. Inside a small apartment on Melrose Avenue, a man is sitting there, talking to his guest like everything is perfectly normal. But there is one problem. That guest has been dead for 2 weeks. And right under the floorboards, directly beneath this man's feet, there is a hidden collection of 12 bodies, all young men.
3 dismembered bodies have been found beneath a house at Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London, and police are now searching a house in Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, where it's believed traces of another 13 bodies may be found.
This is the story of Britain's Jeffrey Dahmer, a man who spent years ending lives right in the middle of London, until, in the end, he was caught because of his own stupidity. On December 30th, 1978, a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Dean Holmes walks into the Cricklewood Arms pub. He tries to buy alcohol, but the bartender refuses to serve him. Then a strange man with glasses and a Scottish accent comes up to him. This grown man offers the boy a different idea. He tells him they can go back to his apartment, have a drink there, and listen to some good music. And the boy agrees. They drink, they get drunk, and eventually both of them fall asleep. But the next morning, the man who owns the apartment wakes up and sees the teenager sleeping beside him. And later, he would claim that in that moment, he became scared. Not scared of the boy hurting him. Scared that once the boy woke up, he would leave. And this man did not want his new friend walking out the door. So, in his twisted mind, he found a way to fix that problem. He used a necktie to strangle the boy. Then, after the teenager lost consciousness, he drowned him in a bucket of water. After that, he hid the body beneath the floorboards. The remains stayed there for the next 7 months, until he eventually burned them in the backyard. Later, the killer himself would write about it this way. I carefully moved him to his new bed under the floorboards. A week later, I started wondering if his body had changed at all, if it had begun to decompose. I dug him out and pulled the young man, covered in dirt, onto the floor. His skin was filthy. I took off all my clothes, carried him into the bathroom, and washed him. And if you think that is already disturbing enough, trust me, it gets worse. Almost a year later, on December 3, 1979, a 23-year-old Canadian student named Kenneth James Ockenden appears at the Princess Louise pub in Holborn. He had come to England as a tourist and was traveling around the country by himself. Once again, the same quiet man with glasses and that Scottish accent approaches him. They start talking, and after that, the two of them spend time walking around London together. Trafalgar Square, Downing Street, Westminster Abbey. Basically, the usual tourist route. Eventually, they end up back at the apartment on Melrose Avenue. What happened inside that apartment is not fully known. But we do know how it ended. Kenneth was strangled with the cord from a pair of headphones. And honestly, the most horrifying part of this case was not even the moment he died. It was what came afterward. Because after killing him, the man hid his body under the floor. Then, whenever he felt like it, he would take the body back out again. And this was not something he did only once or twice. He would place the dead young man in an armchair beside him, pour himself a drink, turn on the television, and sit there next to the body like they were just two people spending an evening together. Just so you understand how sick this was, that nightmare continued for more than 2 weeks. He was trying to create the feeling of company. He wanted someone he could keep forever, someone who could never get up and leave. This maniac was literally collecting bodies. In May 1980, the third victim entered the story, 16-year-old Martin Brandon Duffy, a student at a catering college. The boy had run away from home without telling his parents. He hitchhiked all the way to London and spent 4 days sleeping outside near a train station. That evening, the man we already know was coming back from a union conference. They crossed paths, and of course, he offered the boy food and a place to sleep. Later, he would drown him. And after that, sorry, but I have to say this carefully, this monster violated the boy's body in a deeply disturbing way. He kept the teenager's body inside a closet for 2 weeks before eventually hiding it under the floorboards. The next known victim was 26-year-old William Sutherland, a Scottish man who had come to London hoping to find work. Sutherland was strangled sometime around August of 1980. But his family would not find out the truth about what happened to him until 3 years later. After William, there were many more victims. Some of them have never been identified to this day. And even now, nobody has ever officially reported them missing. Most likely, no one was really looking for these unknown young men at all. London is a massive city. In a place that big, a few disappearances can slip through the cracks way too easily. Even when the number of missing young men climbed past a dozen, nobody connected the dots. In September of 1981, Malcolm Barlow became the serial killer's next victim. He was 23 years old, an orphan, and he struggled with epilepsy and mental health problems. On that final day, Malcolm was sitting outside, leaning against the wall of the building on Melrose Avenue. Yes, the same building. And at that exact moment, the owner of the apartment was coming home. The man in glasses saw him there and called an ambulance. See? On the surface, what a responsible citizen. Barlow was taken to the hospital, but later he returned to that same building. Maybe he just wanted to thank the man who had helped him. The man in glasses let him inside the apartment and gave him rum and coke. The young man fell asleep. And then, right there on the couch, he was strangled. Just think about that for a second. First, the killer called an ambulance and helped save Malcolm. Then, later, he ended that same young man's life with his own hands. Afterward, he hid the body under the kitchen sink. Now, you might ask, why not under the floorboards this time? The answer is simple. There was no space left under the floor. Sometimes, the killer would carry the extra bodies outside and hide them in the yard or garden. But as you can imagine, that was not exactly a quick or easy process. So the bodies beneath the floor had started piling up. Malcolm Barlow became his 12th known victim. Which means that by that point, the real number may have already been even higher. On October 5, 1981, the man in glasses moved out. His new attic apartment was located at 23 Cranley Gardens, in the Muswell Hill area. For what he was doing, this new place was actually much less convenient. There was no garden, and there was no open space beneath the floorboards. But old habits do not just disappear. The killings continued. In March of 1982, 23-year-old John Howlett came to the apartment. Unlike most of the victims before him, John fought back. And I mean, he fought hard. He woke up while he was being strangled. With the noose already around his neck, he started fighting for his life. At one point, he almost managed to strangle his attacker instead, but the killer was able to hit him on the head and overpower him. For about a week after that, the bruises from the struggle were still visible on the maniac's neck. Then, on January 26, 1983, the killer met Stephen Sinclair. Stephen was 20 years old at the time. He was struggling with addiction and had cuts on his wrists. The man bought him a hamburger and brought him back to the apartment. Once they were there, Sinclair took a hard drug starts with the letter H and washed it down with alcohol. After that, of course, he passed out. The killer strangled him with a necktie. And then comes one of the creepiest parts of the entire story. After the murder, the man washed the body, placed 3 mirrors around the bed, lay down beside the dead man, turned Stephen's head toward him, kissed him on the forehead, and whispered, "Good night, Stephen." Dark. Truly dark. This was his 15th known murder. Another terrifying thing about this story is that police had several chances to catch this killer earlier, but they did nothing. For example, there was Doug Stewart. Doug was one of the people who survived an attack. In November of 1980, he woke up with his ankles tied together and a necktie wrapped around his neck. Somehow, he broke free and ran. And what do you think happened after that? The police brushed the whole thing off as some kind of messy argument between lovers. And that mistake mattered. Because if they had taken Stewart seriously and actually searched that apartment, they could have found what was hidden there. The bodies were right under the floorboards. But the police never looked. And why? The answer is ugly, but simple. Homophobia. Stewart later explained it perfectly. The second the word homosexual came into the conversation, the police basically stopped caring. Then there was 21-year-old Carl Stoddard. He was choked until he lost consciousness and then put into a bathtub filled with cold water. Somehow, he came back up, begged, "Enough, enough, please," and then sank under again. When Carl woke up, he was no longer in the bath. He was in bed. The apartment owner was rubbing his arms and legs, acting like he was helping him, and feeding him some ridiculous explanation about getting caught in the zipper of a sleeping bag. Carl pretended to buy the story. But later, when he tried to tell police what really happened, they dismissed him too. They did not believe him. And here is a strange detail. The killer thought Carl was dead. So how did he realize he was still alive? There was a dog in the apartment, and the dog started licking Carl's face. His facial muscles moved, and that tiny reaction gave him away. So why did the killer not end it right there once he knew Carl was alive? Honestly, nobody really knows. Investigators later thought maybe the answer was practical and disgusting at the same time. He might have simply run out of places to hide another body. Another survivor was 19-year-old Paul Nobbs. For reasons nobody can fully explain, he also made it out alive. He woke up early in the morning with a terrible headache. When he went into the bathroom and looked at himself, his eyes were full of broken blood vessels, and his face was completely flushed. Paul went to the hospital, and a doctor confirmed that the marks were consistent with strangulation. But Paul never reported it. He was frightened, and he did not want people digging into his private life. Paul was gay. And then we have Andrew Ho. Same pattern. He was invited back to the apartment, attacked once he got there, and somehow managed to escape. He did go to the police, but he chose not to take the case any further. And there was a reason for that. Andrew was 19 years old. At that time, he was still under the legal age of consent for gay men in Britain. Back in the 1980s, sex between men in the UK was only legal from the age of 21. So just to be clear, if Andrew pushed too hard, he himself could have ended up facing prison time. In the end, the police did nothing. 4 separate incidents were documented. 4 men survived. 4 warnings were basically handed to the system. And the system ignored every single one of them. In early 1980s Britain, missing gay men were not exactly a priority for the authorities. And the killer knew that. He understood the prejudice around him and used it. He picked victims the world was already willing to overlook. But after he moved into the new apartment, his old method became harder to manage. There was no garden. No yard. No useful space under the floor. So he changed tactics in the most horrifying way possible. He began cutting bodies apart and boiling heads, arms, and legs in a large pot on his kitchen stove. The smaller pieces were flushed down the toilet. Larger remains were packed into ordinary plastic bags. Soft tissue and small bones were sent into the sewer system like garbage. And that decision is what finally brought everything crashing down. Because eventually, the plumbing could not take it anymore. On February 4, 1983, people living at 23 Cranley Gardens began complaining about a blocked drain. And guess who was right there complaining with them? The killer himself. This part almost sounds like dark comedy, except it is real. He actually wrote an angry letter to the real estate agents about the plumbing. He said the situation was unbearable and demanded that someone fix it immediately. So yes. This genius complained about a sewer blockage that he had most likely caused himself by flushing human remains down the toilet. Incredible, right? On February 8, at around 6 in the evening, a plumber named Michael Catran arrived to deal with the problem. He opened the inspection cover on the side of the building and looked inside the pipe. And what he saw did not look like normal sewage. There was a strange fleshy mass blocking the pipe. Mixed in with it were small bones. Right then, the killer came outside with one of the neighbors to see what was happening. Catran looked at them and said the material in the drain looked like human flesh. The man in glasses says, "I think somebody must have flushed chicken bones from KFC down the toilet." By that point, it was already dark outside, so the plumber decides to leave it until morning and come back the next day. But that same night, our very polite psycho puts on work clothes, climbs down to the drain, and starts clearing the pipe by hand. Maybe he just really wanted to be helpful. Yeah, sure. In reality, he knew exactly what was happening. By morning, there was a good chance the police would be involved, so he needed to get rid of whatever was left in there. But one of the neighbors sees him doing it. The next day, February 9th, the plumbers come back. And, of course, now the drain is almost clean. Almost. One of them later said they called the police after that strange mass somehow mysteriously disappeared from the pipe. But the killer had not managed to remove everything. Inside the side pipe, the plumbers still find small pieces of bone and bits of flesh. One of them said it looked like bones from a hand or an arm. So this time, they call the police. Forensic pathologist Professor David Bowen examines the material and confirms the worst: these are human remains. And on one piece of skin from the neck area, there is a clear mark that looks like strangulation. After that, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and his colleagues go straight to the apartment of the man this whole story is about. They want to question him. When Jay walks into the apartment, he immediately notices a strong, rotten smell. He asks the tenant what that awful odor is. And the man does not even bother making up a serious lie. He just calmly starts confessing. He tells them that the rest of the body parts are in bags. Maybe by then he understood that pretending was pointless. That same evening, police take 2 bags out of the closet. Inside are dismembered torsos. And that is not all. They also find a bag full of internal organs, a skull with almost no flesh left on it, and a boiled head. And what happened next is exactly what you would expect. On the way to the police station, one of the detectives asks the arrested man, "Are we talking about one body here? Or maybe 2? The man just looks out the window and answers, 15 or 16. Since 1978. The man in glasses was Dennis Andrew Nilsen. He was 37 years old. He worked as a civil servant at a job center, loved his dog named Bleep, and had a serious love for music. And in less than 5 years, he took the lives of at least 12 people. But most likely, the real number was 16. So now let's talk about Dennis himself and how he became this person. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, a small fishing town in Aberdeenshire, all the way up on the northeastern edge of Scotland. It was the kind of place where the wind never really seemed to stop, and the people were tough, quiet, and not exactly warm with strangers. His father, Olav Magnus Nilsen, was a Norwegian soldier. He ended up in Scotland in 1940 after Nazi Germany occupied Norway. He served with the Free Norwegian Forces, and in 1942, he married Betty White. But honestly, from the very beginning, that marriage looked more like an arrangement than a real family bond. Olav was almost never home, and he did not seem very interested in being a husband or a father. Dennis was the middle child, the second of 3. He barely remembered his dad at all. His parents separated when Dennis was only around 3 or 4 years old. Years later, in August 1973, Olav died in Ghana. In his will, he left each of his 3 children £1,000. As a little boy, Dennis grew up in the house of his mother's parents, his grandfather Andrew White and his grandmother Lily. And out of everyone in his childhood, Dennis loved his grandfather Andrew the most. Andrew carried him on his shoulders around the harbor. He took him down to the beach. He brought the boy with him everywhere he could. To Dennis, this man was not just a grandfather. He was the closest person in the world. But on October 31, 1951, Halloween, Andrew White died from a heart attack while he was out at sea. He was 62 years old. His body was brought back home. Dennis's mother, crying, led 5-year-old Dennis into the room where the open coffin was waiting. She told him, "Your grandfather is just sleeping. He has gone to a better place." So this little boy stood there, looking at the still body of the person he loved most. He could not understand why his grandfather was not moving. And then he asked his mother something heartbreaking: "He always took me everywhere with him. Why didn't he take me there?" Years later, Nilsen would write in his autobiography that his grandfather's death fused two ideas together in his mind: love and death. And honestly, the way he later talked about that connection, and how he linked it to his crimes, is deeply disturbing. He wrote that he could only connect with the dead image of someone he loved. In his mind, the image of his dead grandfather became the model for what he later called the clearest expression of love in his imagination. According to him, his victims had to be dead before he could express the feelings he saw as sacred toward his grandfather. He described it as a strange, undeveloped childhood love that had never matured into anything normal. And then he said that looking at his victims gave him a bitter kind of pleasure, along with temporary calm, peace, and satisfaction. Still, one journalist who studied this case had a different view. He believed Dennis may have used the story about his grandfather as a convenient excuse for what he did. Maybe it was not some deep psychological explanation at all. Maybe Dennis invented it later to make his crime sound more meaningful. After his grandfather died, Dennis became more withdrawn. He seemed lonely, strange, and isolated. Around age 10, he almost drowned at the beach. Later, he claimed that while he was underwater, he felt a strange peace. He thought his grandfather was coming to pull him out, but another man saved him instead. At 15, Nilsen joined the army, specifically the Army Catering Corps. According to Dennis, those training years were the happiest time of his life. He served for 11 years in West Germany, Aden, Cyprus, and Berlin. During that time, he learned how to cut up animal carcasses with skill. And yes, that skill would matter later. While serving in Aden, Nilsen was almost kidnapped by a local taxi driver. A man knocked him unconscious and put him in the trunk of a car. But Dennis woke up before they arrived. When the driver opened the trunk, Nilsen attacked him and hit him over the head with a car jack until he passed out. So yeah, another strange little detail. Imagine if that taxi driver had been another predator who could have stopped Dennis before Dennis ever started his own series of murders. Strange thought. Anyway, moving on. It was also during his army years that Dennis began having his first clear fantasies. Once he had a private room, he would lie in front of a mirror so he could see his body, but not his head. Then he would imagine he was unconscious. In that fantasy, the body in the mirror did not feel like his own. It felt like another man's body. That image excited him, and he used it as a substitute for intimacy with another man. After some time in Britain and Cyprus, he ended up back in Germany. There, he hired his first sex worker because he wanted to experience being with a woman. Later, Nilsen described it as disappointing and depressing. After that, he decided there was no question, he was gay. After leaving the army, Dennis joined the police, but he stayed only 8 months. During that time, he realized that visiting morgues gave him a strange kind of satisfaction. He eventually resigned, saying his personal life did not fit with police work. But honestly, the real reason was probably darker. From 1974 until his arrest, Dennis worked as a civil servant at a job center on Denmark Street. His job was to interview unemployed people. And yes, that was exactly the kind of vulnerable person he would later meet in pubs and invite back to his apartment. His supervisor, Ian McKinnon, later told The Spectator that Nilsen once said something disturbing at work: "You know, you could just pick up some homeless guy in a bar and finish him off. Who would notice? Who would care? As for Dennis's personal life, there was not much to talk about. In November 1975, he started dating David Galachon, and they lived together. They even got a small dog named Bleep. But in May 1977, Galachon left, and Dennis was alone again with the dog. Later, Nilsen wrote about loneliness in a dramatic way. He called it a long, unbearable pain and said he never felt like he had a real place in the world. He claimed he created another world where real men entered, where they did not truly suffer under the laws of sleep, and where dreams led to death. According to him, that was his crime. So, as you can see, this killer knew how to write. But he used that talent to make his brutal, creepy, disgusting crimes sound like some kind of dark art. At the same time, Dennis was drinking more and more. He later admitted that whenever work pressure, loneliness, and hopelessness became too much, alcohol became his way out. In his words, drinking and listening to music through his stereo lifted him into another emotional state, something close to ecstasy, joy, and tears. He said that when he drank, he felt like he was being carried out of his lonely little prison of an apartment. And in that state, he wanted to bring other people with him. The problem was, he did not always want those people to leave. He wanted them to stay and share that feeling with him forever. So yes, it really does seem like Dennis was desperate for someone to remain beside him. He would place bodies near him, speak to them for hours, or sit with them while watching television. People who have studied his case usually come back to the same idea: in the dead, he was looking for something he could not get from the living, someone who would stay without conditions, without demands, and without leaving in the morning. Nilsen himself believed that everyone had something dark inside them. In his mind, he was not some unique monster. He thought other people were fascinated by men like him because, deep down, they recognized pieces of themselves there too. He once said that the general public was not as normal or ordinary as it pretended to be. According to him, people were united by their own ignorance of who they really were. He believed everyone had secret dark thoughts hidden away, like skeletons locked inside a closet. And when people looked at someone like him, they were horrified because it reminded them of the parts of themselves they did not want to face. So how do we know all of this? Because during the interrogations, Dennis did not keep quiet. Not even close. He talked. A lot. He gave the police everything himself, often without needing much prompting. In total, there were 16 official interrogations, lasting more than 30 hours. During those interviews, he gave evidence against himself, explained details, corrected mistakes in police reports, and basically helped build the case against him. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. was stunned by it. He could not understand how a man who had done such horrific things could sit there and answer questions so openly, almost calmly, while testifying against himself. And when investigators asked him why he killed, Nilsen gave one of the strangest answers possible. He said, "I was hoping you would explain that to me." Honestly, even his own explanations were blurry and confusing. He believed people always wanted a simple reason for money, jealousy, hatred, revenge, sex, bloodlust, sadism. But according to him, none of those explanations really fit. He described himself as a ruthless killer because of certain circumstances. Then he compared the victim to a dirty plate left after a feast, and the disposal of the body to washing dishes, something cold, ordinary, and almost clinical. Disturbing, right? But that is how he talked about it. Then, on October 24, 1983, Dennis Nilsen appeared in London's Central Criminal Court. He was charged with 6 murders and 2 attempted murders. And here is the strange part. Despite everything, despite his confessions, despite the details he gave, despite the fact that he basically testified against himself, Nilsen pleaded not guilty. He admitted the acts themselves, but he wanted the charges reduced to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. In other words, he argued that he had committed the crimes while suffering from a mental disorder. His lawyer, Ivan Lawrence, called 2 psychiatrists to support that argument. The first, Dr. McKeith, could not give a definite conclusion. The second psychiatrist, Dr. Galway, diagnosed Nilsen with something called false self syndrome. In simple terms, that diagnosis suggested that Nilsen had a disturbed sense of identity, like he was not fully himself, and that these inner problems affected his ability to think clearly and plan his actions in a normal way. But Galway explained it in such a complicated, technical, overstuffed way that even the judge seemed unsure what to make of it. The explanation was so loaded with psychiatric language that the court itself started questioning whether this diagnosis really made sense. The prosecution chose a much stronger strategy. Instead of drowning the jury in psychiatric terms, the prosecutor read Nilsen's police interviews out loud. All of them. It took more than 4 hours. The courtroom listened as Nilsen calmly described, in his own words, every murder, every ritual, and every disturbing detail. Again, he never denied what he had done. He admitted the facts. His only argument was that he had not been fully in control of himself. 3 surviving victims also testified against him. In the end, Judge Croom Johnson recommended a life sentence. He also said a line that later became well known, "You may almost certainly say that his mind was evil." But can a mind be evil and at the same time not abnormal? On November 4, 1983, the jury began deliberating. After more than 12 hours, they reached a majority verdict, guilty on all counts. Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life in prison, with a recommendation that he serve at least 25 years. But in December 1994, that was changed to a whole life tariff. Basically, he was never supposed to walk free. He was meant to die behind bars. And this is one of the harshest punishments in British legal practice. Even in prison, Nilsen did not stay quiet. Over 34 years, he wrote more than 3.5 million words, over 6,000 typed pages. One of those writings was an autobiography called The History of a Drowning Boy. I think you can guess what it was about. The Home Office banned its publication while he was still alive. Prison life was not peaceful for him either. Once, another inmate slashed his face with a razor, and Dennis needed 89 stitches. He was also beaten often. Still, he kept busy. He translated books into Braille, drew pictures, filed lawsuits over magazine censorship, and seemed to enjoy arguing with prison authorities. He also wrote letters to researchers and commented on the Jeffrey Dahmer case. In one letter, he described himself as a small, fragile boy under pressure from powerful forces. It seems this monster never truly accepted responsibility. One researcher noticed that Nilsen constantly described himself as an outsider, someone pushed to the edge of society because of his sexuality, money problems, and family history. He felt sorry for himself and almost saw himself as a victim. But then the researcher realized something chilling. The way Nilsen described himself was almost the same way he described many of his victims, men living on the margins, ignored by society. On May 12, 2018, Dennis Nilsen was 72. He had surgery for a problem with his aorta. After the operation, a blood clot formed in his lungs, and that clot finally ended his life. Only 5 people attended his cremation. They were prison staff. No relatives came. And that is the story, guys. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you want more videos like this. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves.